cropped. There's nothing wrong with being cropped, buddy.
Okay. Well, yeah.
We're live.
Oh, I'll tell you a story about him afterwards. It'll make you laugh.
Okay. I'm always into stories. So I'm going to do a shout out before we start the show because we've got some people here already waiting for us. We've got R2R3 Locking Nut saying, "You guys are awesome. I will catch the replay. I have to go to bed for an early start at work." That's awesome. We remember R2. He's in Chicago.
Cool. We're talking about that tonight.
And then we got Guitar Hack here saying, "Hurry up, I gotta sleep." He's been busy today. I've seen a show that he did earlier. Soda Pop is here. Awesome. Always good to see Soda Pop. And that's it. But that's all we want. Just a small team.
Yep.
Appreciate it, guys. Thanks for joining us. So nobody in the comments from last week gave Carl and I a suggestion of what we could talk about. So we'll talk about what we're going to talk about in the next couple of shows. But Carl and I thought what we could do is just maybe do a conclusion of the Chicago blues scene, because I kind of think I don't know if we've rushed the previous shows, mate, but I certainly think there's so much to talk about, and we'll probably always be talking about some of these Chicago blues for as long as we continue the shows. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a the scope's so wide. It's such a large and in-depth discussion. I mean, you could have a 4-part series on Muddy Waters alone. Muddy Waters pre-war, post-war, Muddy Waters acoustic, Muddy Waters electric, Muddy Waters London sessions with Rory Gallagher. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So I think it's quite neat, though, in the sense that we've basically identified over that 4-week process just some bullet points about the individual and how they impacted not only music but the Rolling Stones. But I'm glad that you're saying, let's summarise, because we've left out a few key people. And we can also add a few more things in as far as just themes and metaphors and the transatlantic thing as well. The big cities the delta to the big city to the big cities in Europe.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. So the theme was, which we touched on a couple of days ago, was blues music's impact on society and musicians and music. Is that right?
Yeah. I kind of mentioned it a few times earlier in relation to the British blues scene. Like I was always fascinated. I'm always fascinated, obviously, about the music, but also what was happening during these important periods in history, what was happening culturally. And I suppose, this goes back to the fact that we love the Stones. And if you look at, say, 1972, if you look at the Stones, if you want to appreciate the Stones, well, you have to look at the fashion, you have to look at the media, the films that were around at that time, because they were influential in these things as well, weren't they? And clearly, I think these blues cats like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, they must have been influential in other parts of what was happening in Chicago during the time when they were reigning.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, it was quite a big deal for these guys. I mean, I admire them, these Chicago guys, because they got a lot of them were given not a fair shake. I mean, obviously they came from. I was just reading up about John Lee Hooker before, which we haven't mentioned, which we'll talk about him in depth tonight.
Mm-hmm.
These guys came from large families, and part of their rites of passage unfortunately, because that's was work in the fields. And I mean, it was a big deal. I mean, they obviously got a bit of obviously their schooling was in the Delta, and I want to do a correction too. Last week, that predominantly all the blues musicians came from Mississippi, not Tennessee. I got those two states mixed up. But yeah, and I want to touch on a theme tonight also that obviously all these guys came from the fields. They were sharecroppers, came from big families. Music was a huge outlet for them, I imagine, and they probably worked long hours, and it's really hot in the Delta, very hot. So music was, to them, was life outside of life. So it was an exciting time, because when they made the transition to the big cities, I mean, can you imagine it? It was just, they were well received. They had something to offer. Not only was there work as far as paying the rent with the big cities, but at night they could play what they love and make cash and meet people, and it was just very exciting.
I always had the impression when you look at Chicago blues, this is the contradiction or the dichotomy, I suppose, you have between blues music, the average perception of what blues music is, the blues, sad. But I always believed that Chicago blues was a celebration of life. It was a celebration of prosperity. It was a celebration of progress, because you had Chicago, you had industry, you had black people from the South moving up and taking advantage and enjoying a material life that previous generations never had. In fact, for the first time, they were probably on par materially with a lot of, white folks.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the movie The Cadillac Records, and for the first time, they said the first big rock and roll song was called Rocket 88. It's about a car, an automobile.
Yeah.
Chuck Berry sung a lot about automobiles. So for the first time, they were driving nice vehicles, wearing nice clothes. It was a big deal to them. Also want to mention Chicago is what they call a Rust Belt city. So the three big cities that were considered Rust Belt cities were Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland.
What do you mean by Rust Belt?
So Rust Belt basically meant that they were towns that lived, big cities that were on the Great Lakes.
Mm.
So it was an industry, steel. So
okay.
Canada, Great Lakes, shipping, containers, prosperity, movement, the economy, ports. Mm-hmm. So Chicago was a huge hub, not only for industry, the economy, second biggest city for the longest time in America, but also a hub for, as you know, the people from the South moving north for prosperity. But let's not forget Detroit either. That's where John Lee Hooker got his start.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Chicago gets a lot of credit for being obviously a blues city, which it is the biggest blues city, but Detroit had a big blues scene as well. That's where John Lee Hooker got his start. So it's quite an interesting journey from the Delta to these big cities, because Howling Wolf didn't start in Chicago. He spent quite a few years in Memphis before he made the trek to Chicago. Sun Studios, Sam Phillips. So it's quite interesting. You had the Delta and the trains moving north, and some of them went to Memphis, some to Detroit, but the majority went to Chicago. So, yeah. But really exciting. I mean, let's face it, the war was over. America was experiencing buoyant times. Obviously, they still had a few issues with segregation, but music was what blended everybody together. So it really was, without the politicians and their stupid laws, it really was quite a liberating force. Music.
So these blues clubs in Chicago in the 30s, 40s, well, maybe not the 30s. So from the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, they weren't segregated.
Good question. The majority of the blues clubs in that were on the south side, which was 99% black. So, and these were pretty tough clubs. So when you read up about Paul Butterfield and Mike Bloomfield, they had some, I'll use the word cojones, pretty big cojones to go into those places because...
And they were only young. They were only young cats.
Yeah. We're still talking about some bitterness from the fields, because you had the sharecroppers and the workers, and then you had the plantation owner. So there still would have been some resentment. But the simple fact that these guys, and we talked about this last week, had a streetwise intellect, a lot of these musicians, they would have been accepting. I was reading up about, it's quite interesting, a lot of these blues musicians were named after American presidents.
Mm.
So Chester Howling Wolf, Chester Burnett was American president. So yeah, very interesting how it all intertwines. But to answer your question, the blues clubs were predominantly black. So
they catered obviously for the industrial workers, the auto workers, the guys working in the what steel mills, is that what they call it? Yeah. Okay. So they'd knock off from work, go and have a few beers, have some scotch or something, and
Yeah. I mean, there's a great DVD. It's called Chicago the Blues Today. I think I might have linked it to you. Or there was some other, and it shows you a club with JB Hutto, and it's predominantly a black club. And it looked pretty rough, but that's what they were. That's the South Side. So yeah, so when live Mr. Kelly's came around 10 years later, Muddy Waters had gone uptown to more of a jazz club, more of an integrated club. So yeah, took a while. But what really helped with these blues guys, and not necessarily being accepted but being noticed, was the American Folk Blues Festival, which started in 1962, which was a German guy came up with the idea, and a couple of other Germans promoted it. That gave these blues guys, instead of listening to these blues guys through the radio, which was great, gave them visual appeal, because all of a sudden they went to Europe, they were put on TV, they seemed larger than life.
Mm-hmm.
So really exciting times for these guys, eh? Work during the day in Chicago and these big cities, more work than they could shake a stick at, because they were good. They played juke joints and clubs, and then all of a sudden, lo and behold, they're on a plane going to Europe.
So when did it end though, mate? We've mentioned this before. One of the reasons why we celebrate and have a lot of respect for the Stones, for example, is that they helped bring about a resurgence to a lot of these blues guys who weren't making any money, who were doing other jobs. So at what point did it stop for them? The rise of rock and roll, the mid 1950s, is that where it stopped being?
You talk about blues music?
Yeah. The blues music for the blues musicians. When did it stop being such a big deal?
I would have to say 66 was a interesting time, because that was we're bordering on psychedelia. So when 67 came around, we had basically a predominantly rock movement. And we know that Jimi Hendrix, as great as he was, a blues lover, was a rock player. So everything, the psychedelic movement basically I don't know. I wouldn't say it killed the blues, but these guys were considered, a former genre almost. And then they got a bit of a kickstart in the early 70s with the universities and that, but they never did big songs after that.
No, what I mean is, I think blues had a slump earlier than that too, Carl, because if you look at, for example, Muddy Waters, there's a famous story that he was painting the studios or painting the ceiling when the Stones came in to record at
65 Chess Studios.
Okay, yeah. So there had to have been a period before 65 where the blues in America stopped being a big deal in America.
It might have been there might have been albums taking over 45s. These guys sold lots of records on 45 singles. So when the Beatles and the Stones came out with the concept of an album, and Keith saying, listen, we changed the course of music because we wanted every song to count. Not saying that the Muddy Waters albums weren't good, but really the best of Muddy Waters was all the 45s on one album.
Sure.
So that would have hurt them a little bit. And then, it's a funny one. It's a funny one. I mean, they still kept working, but I guess once everybody got a taste for the blues and sped it up, rock and roll really took over. And these guys weren't rock artists, let's face it.
There's a couple of comments in the chat, mate, that I'd like to introduce to our conversation. Simon's mentioning the key role of New Orleans too. He's saying, don't forget the role of the Mississippi as a route for goods that arrived in New Orleans and were transported up to Chicago on the river. So yeah, we certainly can say that New Orleans had a big impact too, didn't it? Who's some big blues guys that came from New Orleans? Do you know? Off the top
I can't specifically say New Orleans, but I can say Louisiana, which is the state of
Louisiana.
Lazy Lester, Guitar Slim. I'm pretty sure Guitar Slim was from Louisiana. Little Walter was born in Louisiana. So that's probably the most famous bluesman of them all. A guy called Lightning Slim.
Yes.
He did an album called Rooster Blues. And he was one of the first guys to the swamp guitar. He turned the tremolo up on his Fender amp. He's absolutely mind-blowing. You want to talk about raw. He put a capital R at the word raw. There's a whole bunch of Louisiana guys, but it's quite interesting with Louisiana because they had a different mix altogether. Obviously, it's the birthplace of jazz.
Yes.
But they had the French influence, the Creole, the guy called Clifton Chenier, the accordion. That's another discussion within itself. It's unbelievable. But yeah, no, I agree. Don't discount Louisiana at all.
So, Soda's agreeing with you, saying that the Stones respected all those older blues cats, didn't they? And yeah, absolutely. And we've said it, and they've said it all along, Soda. Right from the word go, they paid respect to these blues cats right from the word go. You know, they didn't hide it or pretend that they wrote all those songs. Here's an interesting comment here before, sorry to interrupt, mate, but Simon's saying 71 was the first year albums outsold singles.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Now it's the other way around. I don't think albums sell at all.
Oh, it's just, yeah. I mean, we're talking about digital live streaming where, yeah. But I'm glad that a lot of bands this day will actually not necessarily lose money, but they'll they'll put out an album just because they know that the album is the true concept of what they want to portray, you know? Because the album, let's face it, is, yeah, I mean, 45s are fun. I own lots of 45s. You spin a 45, you put the B-side on, but an album is really a work of art. It basically shows you what happened that particular year.
An album is a journey.
Mm.
You know, we've said this before, right from, you know, and we're old enough to remember this, and most of the cats in the chat, right from going to the record store, flicking through the records, deciding what record you were going to buy, taking that home, dropping it, and then sitting there looking at the album cover and trying to decipher any messages, any symbols, any code that was on that record cover sleeve, and listening to that whole album. Great times.
Yeah. No, an album was based, like you mentioned, the word codes, which is quite interesting because you had the liner notes, which you'd read. And then you had, for example, the songs, then in brackets, who wrote the song. And then some of these albums are clever enough to have how long the song went for. And the producer, the engineer, it was a body of work. Basically, yeah. I mean, let's face it, if you're a real music lover, you bought an album. The radio was basically designed for instant gratification.
The radio was the gatekeeper, wasn't it? You know, the radio was the song that you first heard, "Start Me Up," you know, and or you would listen to the top 10 and you'd listen to the songs and you would make a list and you would decide, because we didn't have much money, you would decide what record you were going to buy.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's been times when especially in America, when you listen to radio a lot more, because a lot of stations, where you hear a song and it would make your day. And then you didn't know the artist, but you'd try and find out and you ask some questions and then you bought the album. So the radio, like you say, was the first introduction. Radio is probably the best form of publicity there ever is. It's the initial sound. And then I guess the closing aspect would be the visual, you know, the album cover, the video single, the TV, the documentary, the interview.
Were you the one that somebody told me recently about the way that some albums were produced? They were produced in a specific way. They were mixed in a specific way to make them sound better because of the radio. Was it you that was telling me that? And that's why some recordings aren't very good.
Yeah, I remember our mutual friend Cookie telling me a long time ago that I think the radios, the singles on the radio sounded a bit over the top to appear really large, to fill up the car.
Yep.
But when you put it on wax, it was a totally different sound. So the true hallmark of a good recording was the actual album itself, not the radio song. Because with the radio, you can hear the voice, you can hear the guitar, high-pitched instruments, but the bass is muffled, drums are average. So, yeah, the radio can hide a lot. It's almost like a filter, where the true essence of a good recording is on the album itself.
I just want to do a quick shout out. We've got a couple of guys in the chat, buddy. We've got Arvin saying g'day, and we haven't seen Arvin for a couple of weeks, so it's always nice. Pooh Ninja. I've come across Pooh Ninja in a couple of other shows, specifically Ben Coombs' show, and I think he runs his own show too, and also on the Johnny Bean show. So thanks for stopping by, Pooh. And yeah, thanks. And Simon's saying it's also extra production the radio did when broadcasting it. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, like you mentioned the words "Start Me Up," "Satisfaction." Those are all pretty hot singles, and they just really jumped through the radio, didn't they? They really did.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. So, who was the cat that you mentioned earlier at the start of the show? Lightning Hop. Was it
Johnny
Lightning
Hooker.
Hopkins?
Johnny Hooker.
Johnny Hooker. Yeah. So tell us about Johnny Hooker.
Yeah, interesting guy. He, I mean, we obviously talked about Muddy and Bo Diddley being a huge influence, but Johnny Hooker was a massive influence on some of these really other big British acts, Yardbirds, The Animals, and Van Morrison. So when we think of Van Morrison, we think of this great solo act, but we forget about his first band, which is called Them, which were in some parts of the British Isles as big as the Stones.
Oh, really?
Huge. Gloria.
Oh, yeah. I just love the Doors version to that too. Yeah.
Al, he teaches you how to spell. I mean, it's just an awesome song. You listen to that early Them. That's some raw blues R&B rock. That's a very young, ginger-headed Van Morrison, 21, standing 5'4".
So they were rivals to the Stones.
Not rivals, but I mean, and I'm going to say as good as.
Wow.
Yep. They had a tight band. They could do the blues well. They could rock it up. Baby Please Don't Go was a big song, a blues cover. Them is another topic within itself. So John Lee Hooker was a huge influence on the British blues R&B rock movement. Massive. Boom Boom, Dimples. One bourbon, one scotch, one beer, which George Thorogood obviously did.
Boogie Chillin'.
Crawling King Snake. So he was, and what's interesting about John Lee Hooker is he taught a lot of musicians the simple art of less is more. I mean, he would play a song in the same key, the same chord, but what made him a little bit different, it was he'd change tempos. So very raw, very stripped down. And another important figure in the blues movement, huge. I mean, and there's no way that you could copy his sound. He was just one of those guys that had perfected a sound early on, became his signature, and just another giant. Mississippi Boy, went to Detroit and recorded for various labels.
So did he have an influence specifically on Keith or Brian? Do you know of?
I mean, I'm sure they loved him. John Lee Hooker had quite a good little resurgence in the 80s and 90s with The Healer and Havana Moon. So he played with the Thunderbirds, Bonnie Raitt, Los Lobos, Carlos Santana, whole bunch of these guys. They loved him. Obviously, Van Morrison, that was his father figure. Because in the early 70s, John Lee Hooker's on TB Blues. I think it was about tuberculosis. Or TB Sheets. So John Lee Hooker is another really important part of the puzzle with Chicago blues because he did record with Chess, yes, a couple of great albums, probably more, but he was another giant. And less is more. I mean, his guitar solos, 2 or 3 notes. That's it.
Well, here's a segment out of Keith's book, Life, and I won't read it, but this is a letter he wrote to Dear Pat, and he's talking about how he's just met Mick Jagger, and the quote, he's got every Chuck Berry ever made, and all his mates have too. They are all rhythm and blues fans, real R&B, I mean, not this Dinah Shore, Brooke Benton crap. Jimmy Reed, Muddy Waters, Chuck, Howling Wolf, John Lee Hooker, all the Chicago bluesmen, real low down stuff, marvelous. Bo Diddley, here's another great. So he's mentioning these cats in 19. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And he's saying here, I play guitar Chuck Berry style.
Yes.
Swinging.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got all these guys coming at you, and you can't play like everybody, so you're going to have to pick a certain person. So in Keith's life, Chuck Berry was his guy. Mick Jagger, he emulated, in a sense, I guess, James Brown and the R&B guys. Brian Jones loved Elmore James and Bo Diddley. Van Morrison was a big John Lee Hooker guy.
Okay, so who did you try to emulate then as a guitar player? Because I know exactly what you mean by you have to nail somebody down. You love all these guitar players. You've got all these guitar players. So which one am I going to try and follow? So who was your main man?
I like Buddy Guy probably.
Wow.
I mean Stevie. We all love Stevie Ray Vaughan, but you can't emulate his sound. I mean, drop tuning, fat strings. I mean, I don't have the money to buy his gear. And he's such a unique, cool guy that let's just keep him Stevie. Buddy Guy gave us all a blueprint for playing good music. And I forgot to mention this about Buddy Guy a few shows back, but Jimi Hendrix would stop the train, stop the bus. He'd stop paying rent to attend Buddy Guy's shows to sit at the front row, try and steal licks. That's how good Buddy Guy was.
Yeah. I was a little bit like you, I suppose. You know, I remember watching Stevie Ray Vaughan. I was a young guy.
Yeah.
What was the song, the video where he's got this woman and
Cold Shot.
She's going crazy because all he's doing is playing the guitar.
Cold Shot.
Yeah, okay. So I'm hearing that going, wow, I want to learn to play that. And no, I can't do this. So that's fine. A little bit like you. Okay, so we'll put that over there in the too hard basket.
Agree.
But no disrespect to Eric Clapton, but yeah, he was my number two guy. He was that was when I heard some of that Clapton stuff, and I thought, yeah, that's what I want to try and emulate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then Eddie Van Halen.
Yeah.
But who can emulate these guys?
Can't. I mean, you can get some ideas, but wow, yeah, no, they're and here's another fun fact: is a lot of those early John Lee Hooker recordings, especially the chess ones, it's Buddy Guy on second guitar.
Yeah, so, he's a giant. We mentioned that '68 album, didn't we? If you want
A Man in the Blues.
Yes. Yeah, if you guys in the chat want to check out a Strat just playing through a Fender amp, that's the album.
Mm. And also, I'm glad that you've actually picked to summarise the show, because this brought back a few memories. Howling Wolf, his hero, because I love the fact that there's no colour in music. And when we think of blues, we think of primarily black music. But Howling Wolf's hero was a little guy called Jimmy Rogers. And Rogers is spelt with a D. So there's two Jimmy Rogers. There's the black guy that played guitar with Little Walter and Muddy Waters. But there's a little guy who died premature at the age of 32. They called him the Singing Brakeman. Leonard Skinner did a song called Blue Yodel or something. But he was a yodeler. He rode trains. He was a bluesman. He was a little white guy, but he did the yodel. So here's a 6'3" guy, 136 kilos. And his main inspiration for music was a guy that was about 5'5", probably weighed 40 kilos soaking wet, and he rode trains. Jimmy Rogers. Rogers with a D.
So did Howling Wolf hang out with Jimmy Rogers?
No, just like a lot of these guys, just had his ear plugged to the radio. And a lot of these guys loved Hank Williams. We talk about Ray Charles, loved country music. That was his first love because of the storytelling.
Mate, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. This book here, Escaping the Delta, and it's a wonderful book. It's about Robert Johnson, and it makes the argument very clear that Robert Johnson was playing brilliant country music at white gigs.
Yeah. Well, it's just funny how society tries to separate colour and race and ethnicity and all that sort of thing, but the South was a melting pot of just amazing music. Simon mentioned Louisiana and the jazz, the Creole, the French immigrants, the Cajun music, fiddle, Western swing, Bob Wills. That's why these English guys were just like, in a way, this is new, but it's not new because this is our forefathers were doing this Scotch-Irish music. And we mentioned Van Morrison, the Celtic music. So this music was basically a diversion from the everyday mundane life of working 8 to 5 and paying taxes. It was a celebration. So Jimmy Rogers, research that guy. He's just phenomenal. You want to talk about Robert Johnson sounding eerie? He's just as eerie.
So I'm just going to do a shout out. Pooh Ninja's leaving us. So thanks for joining us, Pooh. Appreciate it. I think this is the first time you've joined in and had a chat with Carl and I and everyone else in the chat. But Soda's mentioned something interesting, and it's just a continuation of something that we were just talking about a little bit earlier, Carl. Clapton first heard Stevie Ray Vaughan on the radio and he had to pull over. By the end of the day, he had to know who that guitar player was, and that's absolutely correct. He was driving and he heard this cat, and he knew that it was new enough, but sounded old enough, but not an old. It wasn't an old recording he was listening to. He had to find out.
Right.
And unfortunately, we all know the story. You know, Clapton was on stage with him for his last gig 30 minutes before he died.
Yep. Well, Stevie had a very unique sound because when Clapton attended one of his shows, he said, "This is too loud." But then after a while, he realised, hey, that's Stevie. That's this Texas barroom sound. He is playing balls to the wall. That's a Roadhouse sound. It's different. And then he obviously got to like it.
I never forget. I don't know what the amp was. It was a Fender amp anyway. I would have been about 19 years old. And we went to a party. And I remember, and it was a Mexican Strat this guy had. And there was no pedal. And I remember he turned this thing up. And it was, it was so clear. But gee, it was loud, and that was my first appreciation of listening to, a Strat played really, really loud.
Yeah.
So loud that you could lean on it. But yeah, I've read that too, mate. That was one of the reasons why he didn't get a lot of gigs early on, because he didn't want to turn his music down, his amp down. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, and that shows you how good a player he was. So when Stevie recorded albums, he sounded just like the concerts. So basically, he was recording live all the time. And when you're playing clean and loud, you better be good because you cannot hide behind distortion.
So he was onto it enough because he'd been playing in bars and he'd been schooled and taught by his brother, who was a phenomenal guitar player. So he was onto it really early to know that if you were going to buy my records, you were going to hear that when I was playing live.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I said to my uncle one time, I said, he just sounds, when he was playing live, he just sounds like the record. That's, wow. I mean, I was impressed. He goes, you know what? He's just playing live all the time. There's no doctoring. There's no editing. There's no overproducing. He was a clever guy. And that's when you watch his interviews, here's another guy that always back to the blues. Obviously, he loves his fans, but he always goes back to the blues saying, I don't care if I don't sell any records. I just love this music. I've got this passion for these guys. I love Albert King and Freddie King. I love Buddy Guy. I'm actually glad to talk about Stevie because they kind of put these blues guys on a shelf, America did. And Clifford Antone, when they opened up the Antones Club in 1975, brought all these guys down to Austin, Texas, and said, Muddy Waters live on stage, Blue Monday, and the Fabulous Thunderbirds were the house band to a lot of these guys. So it was an exciting time once again.
So that's interesting. You should say that. So Jimmy was learning from these old cats, these giants, and in turn teaching Stevie.
Yes. Yeah, Jimmy was definitely a blues man. Stevie Ray Vaughan loved the blues, but he loved Jeff Beck, loved Lonnie Mack. And a lot of these guys were really turned on by the Yardbirds. So the Yardbirds, obviously with the Jeff Becks, the Jimmy Pages, who were big blues guys, it was all part to parcel. It was everyone was complimenting each other. Obviously, some people stole and some people made a bit more money, but in the day, it always goes back to these key figures, these blues guys. I wrote a note here about, where was it? Led Zeppelin. We love Jimmy Page, but they were they were scoundrels. You Shook Me. That was a Muddy Waters song. The Lemon song, that's supposed to be Killing Floor. So yeah. Yeah.
Now Stevie gets a lot of love on this show. Absolutely. You know, he's we talk about how Eric Clapton and the Rolling Stones turned a lot of people onto blues music. For cats in the 60s, in the early 1980s, Stevie Ray Vaughan was doing it for.
Yeah, well, yeah. So you mentioned, good point. The 40s, the war had ended, the cities were flourishing. We mentioned the Rust Belt cities, Detroit, Chicago for sure. Cleveland to a lesser extent. I lived in Cleveland and did not really take off. But then obviously the 50s came around. We had the TV, we had Elvis, we had Buddy Holly, we had a lot of these guys selling lots of 45s. Early 60s came around. We had the British movement, the Europeans, the Stones, the Beatles, the Them, Animals. Then we had obviously these great tours where they came to Europe, well received, the American Folk Blues Festival, psychedelic movement. But the early 70s was great. We had the London Howling Wolf sessions.
Brilliant.
With Eric Howling Wolf, the Stones rhythm section, Billy Wyman and Charlie Watts. We had the Muddy Waters session, which had a young Rory Gallagher, which doesn't get enough credit, an Irish blues man. And then when the 80s came around, guess who basically reignited the flame? I mean, all these guys are still doing what they're doing, but Stevie said, you know what? I'm going to plug this thing in, turn up 10, and like, who the hell is this guy?
Yeah.
So I think he was. I mean, I love Gary Clark. I know Gary Clark, but Stevie was the last big figure to really put the blues back on top of the shelf again.
He was the last figure, absolutely. We've had Kenny Wayne Shepherd come along and pay homage to him, and he had one big song, his first hit, Blue on Black, I think in '97, but didn't maintain that. But still, he's a monster. He's still out there, still touring. In fact, he was in Australia only a couple of weeks ago playing a couple of gigs. And but certainly, Carl, you're absolutely right, buddy. Stevie Ray Vaughan was a giant. He put it back right on the top. And I remember listening to that second album when it came out, and getting a bit of stick from a couple of workmates because it was blues music. Interesting how people had a perception of blues music, that it was old stuff. Interesting, even back then. But just listening to that album going, wow, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's unfortunate. The mass populace is socially programmed to accept something that's not, that's because someone else likes it, or because the radio or the TV said this is what's popular. It takes a certain person, and I think an authentic person, to think outside the box and say, this is real. This is
and Stevie Ray Vaughan did that because, again, I think you and I mentioned it in a previous show. He could have had 10 limousines. He could have toured the world with David Bowie, playing a couple of licks and playing on his Let's Dance tour. But what did he say?
He said, "I miss my band. I miss Texas.
This is not me.
Yeah,
this is not me." So he traded in, Cadillacs and limousines for a van.
Well, that album, Let's Dance, is a phenomenal album. I own it.
It's a brilliant album.
Produced by Nile Rodgers.
Yeah, the hit maker.
And that song China Girl, it's a bit of a New Zealand reference because he was singing about a Chinese girl that was from New Zealand.
Yes.
Who appeared on Gloss, which I remember watching as a kid, but never really came to fruition. Sorry?
Jin Lee was her name, or Mei Ling or something.
So here's Stevie, this little guy with his big hats in New York City, and the limousines picking him up, and all sorts of party favors in the back. And obviously, it's like, wow. And David Bowie had a good ear. He said, "You know what? I love this album, but we're missing something." And I don't know how. I think that Montreux Festival '82 was a big deal for Stevie because I think David Bowie was in the audience.
Yep.
And then Mick Jagger and Ron Wood were talking about him. He said, "I need that on my album. I'm sick of these hired New York session guitar gunslingers who are not that good." Because at that particular stage, there was a lot of Purple, and there was almost that Joe Satriani thing going on, starting to merge. He goes, "This is real. This is a guy with a Strat playing larger than life." And those solos are what made the album in a way. But after that, obviously David Bowie offering him this gig and Stevie not really enjoying it, he said, "I don't want to sell out." And that's what solidified his authenticity in his relationship with Tommy Shannon and Chris Layton. We're sticking with this guy because he believes in us. They
became they reinforced each other as individuals and made that pact of a band more concrete, I suppose.
And what's quite funny, and I forgot what the book is called, but when Stevie said, "You know what? Here's my resignation, David. Thanks for the couple of songs, 2 or 3 songs. Appreciate the exposure." David Bowie was miffed.
Yeah, no, it's not in that one.
Yeah.
Hey! I've got to tell you guys something. This is funny. See this book here? Okay, so it's Stevie Ray Vaughan. It's a collection of interviews from Guitar Player magazine.
Yeah.
And when I bought it, I bought it a couple of years ago from one of the local music shops. And anyway, one of the young guys who served me said, "Oh, that's a good book." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "He dies in the end." I laughed. I thought, because,
Like a movie.
Yeah. Anyway.
No, well, he's larger than life for sure. But what's quite funny, just a little fun fact, is when Stevie handed his notice in, the video to Let's Dance, or was it China Girl, it's got David Bowie with the Strat, with the white glove, playing the solo.
Yes.
And Jimmy said, I think this might have been a bit ad-libbed or a bit fabricated, he says, "You don't need that guy anyway. You did the right thing."
But I remember when I became a Stevie Ray Vaughan fan and reading and Rip It Up that he was the guitar player in that album, on that album, I should say. And I remember telling people, "Oh, that's Stevie Ray Vaughan playing the guitar on that song." And people would say, "No, what would Stevie Ray Vaughan be playing with David Bowie?"
No. It was. I'm glad you mentioned that. It was great that. So let's face it, the blues have been around since, on record, since 1930. Then obviously there was the war, and then it came back to the 45, Chicago, the Rust Belt, the British movement. So 30 to 80, 50 solid years of a music genre that is the key element, I think, of all modern music.
No argument from me.
Yeah. And I'm going to mention too, and I'm glad Simon mentioned this about jazz. Jazz was basically blues's older, cleaner brother. Because let's not forget that some of these blues guys had jazz influences. So when we think of blues, we think of raw and dirty. There's some good blues out there that's very much jazz blues. The T-Bone Walker, some of John Lee Hooker's recordings were very jazzy. Muddy Waters' recordings are very jazzy. So it's this beautiful circle that keeps going round.
Yeah, I'm reading a book at the moment called Experiencing Jazz Music, and it's giving me some insights because I always wanted to appreciate jazz music more. And I've listened, and I own copies of Kinda Blue, and I've got some John Coltrane stuff here. And who's the white cat that played the trumpet?
Chet Baker.
Chet Baker. Yeah. So, but I could never really sink myself into it because I'd listen to it, and it was just all the stuff going on. It was just like, over here, over there, and it was just like too much for me.
Yeah.
But apparently it's because it's the way I'm not listening to it properly.
I don't know. I agree. I like the smooth jazz blues. I'm not really too much into the bebop or improv or the acid jazz. I mean, Love Supreme, John Coltrane. I mean, it's a classic, but he's out in the stratosphere somewhere.
Wow. Yeah, locked himself literally in his attic, or in a room, and wrote that. Yeah.
I think part of the problem is you had a lot of these music critics and a lot of these so-called intellects that basically nerdified that sort of genre and made it all intellectual. So, yeah, but these jazz guys are great. But once again, the blues is at the forefront, I think. T-Bone Walker, we can't mention him enough.
What I like about the blues, when I heard it, I thought, that sounds like something I could play.
Yeah.
And then I got a guitar, and then okay, I could play a 12-bar shuffle. So yeah, that was great. That's what I love about the blues. Is that it can be as easy as you want and as complicated as you want.
Yep.
And lots of people can play it. Jazz, well, you know, I can't play jazz, and
No.
you know, you can't jam to jazz unless you are a jazz musician. And I don't know any jazz musicians, but I know a few blues guys.
Here's another fun fact. So you know how we have all these catchphrases like, well, the most common one is cool. Cool.
Cool. Yeah.
That came from the jazz scene in the 30s. Their music was considered cool, like ice. And there was a lot of heroin was involved with jazz, eh?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and marijuana.
Yeah. So it was a very, very unique genre, really. It was these guys were unbelievably talented, but blues is more identified, I think, like we've talked about this before, simplicity, working class, 12 bars, do your 40 hours, have some fun. That's why it's so popular.
I've seen it a few times, and if you cats in the chat want to check it out, it's a movie that Clint Eastwood, who incidentally is a big jazz nut, produced and directed. Bird with who's the guy acting as
but Charlie Parker.
Charlie Parker. I forget the guy's name, but you guys will know who I'm talking about. Black guy. But that great movie.
Very good. I own it. Yeah, it's it shows you his start, his height, his career, and then his demise. Is that right?
Yeah. Have you got Bird?
Yeah. On DVD, I think. I'm pretty sure I have it.
Oh, I might have to loan it off you again because it's not available on digital download anywhere.
Oh, really?
No, it's not. So if I could borrow it off you.
It was played by the guy that was in the Last King of Scotland.
Forrest Whitaker.
That's him. Phenomenal actor.
Brilliant job.
Yeah. But yeah. So I mean, yeah, we got to love the blues. We have to love it.
Well, look at Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen could play just about every Eric Clapton lick he did in Crossroads. In fact, on YouTube, there's it's a famous interview. He's having an interview with some chick, and he mentions that he can play it, and she says to him, "Oh, can you do it?" And so he's playing Crossroads.
Yeah,
you know, and we all know that he's said it was Clapton. In fact, there's an interview on YouTube too a couple of years ago that he did at the Smithsonian, and the woman that's interviewing him again mentions Jimi Hendrix, and he said no. He makes a point of correcting her. No. My mentor, the guy that influenced me was Clapton, not Hendrix.
Wow. Have you seen that clip of Van Halen doing Outside Woman Blues?
Yeah. It's with Sammy Hagar.
This one was David Lee Roth.
Oh, no, I haven't seen the one with Roth.
Oh, the tone and the sound was just perfect. It was unbelievable. And I never knew, because of obviously befriending you on that. I knew of Eddie Van Halen as this great guitar player. Van Halen's this really fun band, and forgive me for my naivety, but I always thought they were quite a radio band. I don't own their albums. I loved Hot for the Teacher. I loved Panama. I loved their excitement, their energy. I didn't realise that Eddie was a blues Eric Clapton freak. So that gives me more appreciation, not only for Eddie, but for the blues.
Yeah, well, and me too, absolutely. And it's interesting actually, because when you look at his statement saying that Clapton was instrumental in his development as a musician and a guitar player. So if you listen to some of the melodies of some of those songs, those guitar songs that you're talking about, Van Halen songs, there's a melody going on there, man. You know, it's wow. You got it. Wow.
Have you heard of this term called Eddie Van Halen saying, "I'm a tone chaser." Have you heard of that term?
He's a tone chaser for his own tone. I'm a tone chaser for everyone's tone. But yeah,
have you heard that term?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He makes it. He says that every time he comes out with a new guitar or a new amp or a new effect.
Okay.
I'm a tone chaser.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's why I've made this, and I want you to buy it.
But if you think about it, like you mentioned, Buddy Guy and Man the Blues, John Lee Hooker, a lot of these guys, they got Peter Green. You know, they got these unique tones out of just a random guitar they bought, or an amp that they just discovered, or a mistake, or losing a couple of fingers, or the pickup going around the wrong way. It's just fascinating.
Well. Again, I suppose it's no surprise for a lot of guys in the chat, but Eddie Van Halen made a guitar because he'd been playing a Strat and he'd been playing a Les Paul, and he wanted to get that Gibson sound into a body of a Strat. So that's why he made that first guitar, by putting a Gibson PAF pickup in a Strat body, because that was part of the feel that he wanted, and the sound, and he wanted to get some gain. So how is he going to get some gain through that amp, through his Marshall? So he got a voltage, a thing to drop the voltage, so he could crank it up. All when he was 20 years old, or even younger.
Amazing. He's basically a Mozart. And getting back to Eddie and back to the blues, a lot of these guys, and we talked about amps before, Guitar Slim, Pat here, a lot of these guys, Rocket 88, were playing 15 watt, 30 watt amps turned up to 10. So a lot of these guys, Eddie and those guys who are looking for the certain tone, a lot of this tone was basically provided by a budget. They had no money. Let's just turn this thing up.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah. You got to turn it up. You got to get the amp working.
So yeah. No, I just it's a fascinating journey. It really is. I wish, a part of me wishes I could just go back to the old days, really, myself. Go back to America where times were simpler, and just keep reading these books and listen to this music. My job is so, what's the word? Consuming. I don't get to do this sort of stuff. So that's why this show is so good.
Oh, and we appreciate you coming on board, because if it wasn't for you, my friend, contributing everything to it, we wouldn't have a show. So,
yeah.
And again, Carl and I appreciate everyone jumping in and joining us. Sonia is saying hi. She's just jumped in, so it's always good to see Sonia. She's been with us from the start.
Yep.
Soda Pop is again always jumps in and says g'day. Arvin again. So we just, like we've said it lots of times, we just like talking about music, and if you guys want to participate and join in with us, that's all cool.
Yeah. No, I'm glad that we summarised the blues, because we got to talk about John Lee Hooker.
Well, we didn't really. I think we talk more about Stevie Ray Vaughan than John Lee. But that's the great thing about an unscripted show.
Yeah. Well, with John Lee Hooker, I mean, he wasn't a big part of the Stones sound, but they could appreciate him. But like I said, the Stones could only pick a certain amount of people to make this sound. I mean, let's face it, there's 20 or 30 great blues musicians that were on record that are amazing. That, I mean, we forget about Otis Spann and his solo albums. We forget about Jimmy Rogers did some solo albums. All these guys did solo albums. But we just got to keep bringing it back to the big guys,
I appreciate the discipline that Keith displayed at an early age, because he was young enough to appreciate that he needed to listen to all these blues guys with these records that he could get his hands on. But he was smart enough and disciplined enough to know that well, I can't run down the road trying to pick up bits and pieces of everybody.
Yeah.
I don't have enough time. So what I'll do is I'll nail Chuck Berry.
Yes.
I'll
Yes.
nail him, and then
Yes.
anything else I'm listening to, if that comes through, well, then I've done well.
Right. There's a saying that we have at our work, and you probably heard this with our particular work, which is sales: success leaves clues. So obviously Chuck was successful. What's the clues? Let's emulate Chuck. What's Chuck doing? He's creating an exciting sound. What's a lot of these guys doing? Creating a great sound, but we can only pick one or two. So yeah. I'm glad that Keith did pick Chuck because, I mean, you know, the rock. You can't have blues without a bit of rock because we can't listen to blues all the time. As much as I love the blues, and blues will always be my favourite. Rock basically gets the day going, doesn't it? And the rock wouldn't be anything without the blues.
Have you seen the Jeff Beck video? Soda's asking.
No. Jeff Beck's an interesting guy. I want to get to know him. I don't know much about him. I love his time with the Yardbirds and with Rod Stewart. I don't know much about him. One of my favourite guitar solos of all time is Evil Hearted You. That solo is a Fender Tele turned up to 10 on a little amp, and he's playing the slide with his ring, not his ring finger, a ring. It's just unbelievable. Reverb drenched up to about 6 or 7.
Yeah,
so
that Beck-Ola and Truth are just the phenomenal albums, aren't they?
yes, he doesn't get quite the credit I think he deserves because he's a little bit like the English version of Stevie. He basically said, you know what, this is my love. I'm going to keep exploring. I don't care if I don't get a hit single. I'm just doing what I do.
Well, there's a film that's just a movie that just came out, I think, early this year, and it's on his life. And you're right, he says exactly that. You know, there's been a couple of times where he's just walked away. He walked away from the faces. You know, he just and went back home because he didn't want. This wasn't right for him. You know. But what's interesting though is that he talks about Hi Ho Silver Lining.
Yeah.
He didn't want to record that.
Oh, is that right?
No, he didn't want to, but he did. You know,
is that a bit like Eric Clapton with For Your Love?
For Your Love, yeah. But I think it's made him a bit of money over the years.
Yeah, and I think Eric Clapton is deep down, quite subtly, a huge Jeff Beck fan.
Oh, he says it very, very, very clearly in that DVD. They're interviewing Clapton right at the start, and he just said right from the word go, he said Beck was doing stuff that we couldn't do.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting because Eric had a model, a formula. Jimmy Page did the same thing. Jimmy Page branched out into some Indian music and different tunings and mandolins. But Jeff Beck was doing some pretty interesting stuff way before these guys were even considering doing interesting stuff.
Well, I don't think Jeff Beck didn't ever want to be a blues man like Clapton wanted to be. So that's only natural, I suppose, that Clapton is going to go down that road. I don't know what Jeff Beck wanted to be. Just a guitar player, didn't he?
I'm not sure. There's one song that I like.
See you, Soda.
There's what? Yeah, I've forgotten the song. It'll come to me. We'll have to catch the next show. But it's just a really, and it shows you the first influence of Jeff Beck discovering Eastern music. He was ahead of his time. Let's face it.
Yeah. And you go and watch him now, you know, playing, and he's just drenched in reverb, and he's playing a slide on that Strat, and he's just doing all this, and he's using that trem on his. It's phenomenal.
He's what he is he's basically one of these guys that doesn't get the credit he deserves.
And he builds hot rods too.
Yeah. He's a. Let's have a look here. I'm just going to find the song because it's bothering me.
You find it.
Heart Full of Soul.
Yes.
So that intro was quite unique. That intro was quite unique. It was the start of the psychedelic kind of a thing. So yeah.
Fiercely independent. You're right. I like the similarity you raised between him and Stevie Ray Vaughan. Yeah, this is the way I want to do it.
Yep. Cool. Yep. Because when we think of the Yardbirds, amazing school of guitar players, eh? Eric was obviously the initial, not necessarily leader, but the initial guitar hero. Jeff Beck came along. A lot of people don't know this, but Jimmy Page was hired to play bass. He was so good that he started playing lead. So, yeah. But I've got to close out.
Awesome.
I have to got an 8 o'clock appointment.
No, appreciate it. It's always cool. I'm going to say again quickly, g'day and goodbye to everybody in the chat. Carl and I will catch up with you guys next week, and I'll leave Carl to say the last lines.
Oh no, we can both say basically the 4-part series I really enjoyed doing. I'm glad Andrew mentioned summarising, because we've mentioned some stuff that obviously, because it's such a huge topic in sense of, you know, so many people you can and can't include. We've mentioned John Lee Hooker, which is, and we mentioned the word working class blues, Van Morrison, them. I wanted to make a little kind of point. We mentioned Chicago blues, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland being port cities, industry. Europe, London, Liverpool, Belfast, Dublin, port cities as well. So these young English guys, working class guys, could relate to these black guys in a sense, you know. You know, we're doing the same thing. We're getting up every morning. We're paying our bills. We're, you know, we're fighting.
Oh, I think you mentioned it earlier. Music knows no colour.
Yeah. So yeah. What a time! What a time! I wish I was born 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier.
I'm just glad you were born.
So the main thing is that's the great thing about music is when you move on to the next level, when you pass on, like Stevie said, he's got his music.
Absolutely.
The music's eternal. So yeah.
Well, we're getting some good feedback from everyone in the chat. So everyone's saying, enjoying it, you know, enjoying what we're doing. So that's cool. Arvin's saying he loves it. Sonia's saying goodbye. Again, Simon Williams is wishing everyone take care. Mark Dillon, who I've not seen in the chat before, is saying hi. So maybe you want to catch us next week, Mark, because Carl and I are going to knock off. So appreciate you stopping by for a couple of minutes anyway to say g'day to us.
Also, just real quickly, and this has really helped me out a lot, is try and find the American Folk Blues Festivals on DVD. It's a 3-part series. It's a great introduction to all these Chicago guys, the Southern guys, different styles of music. Skip James, Big Joe Williams with a 9-string guitar. Who's ever heard of that? He's one that wrote.
Can you send me a link?
Oh, it's a phenomenal DVD series. It's 3 parts. It's beautiful.
Yeah, send me a link to it so I can do some research, mate. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And also Jimmy Rogers. Everybody knows, obviously, Hank Williams, but research Jimmy Rogers. He is a giant. when we talk about Robert Johnson, he's for the lack of a better word, the white version. Very airy, very short career, but huge impact.
Okay, and Wednesday Store has jumped in. So I remember Wednesday Store from a previous episode. So yeah, we're signing off Wednesday, but we appreciate you saying good day and hi to us. And and Mark's saying he caught the last 30 minutes. So appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Well, we're going to knock off now. And we'll wish you all the best from New Zealand.
See you guys.